Good evening. I'm Melissa Tenney, president of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to tonight's Visiting Artist Program, one of SAIC's oldest and most prestigious public programs, which hosts a variety of talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars. This will be a very special evening for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we're about to hear from internationally celebrated artist Shirin Neshat about her poetic and evocative images, films, and artworks. It's also a special evening because we welcome Shirin tonight as this year's Bill and Stephanie SAIC Distinguished Visiting Professor. A member of the school's Board of Governors and a member emerita of our Board of Trustees, Stephanie and her husband, Bill, are extraordinary friends to the school, having established both the Stephanie and Bill SAIC Professor of Fashion, Body, and Garment and the Bill and Stephanie SAIC Distinguished Visiting Professorship we celebrate tonight. Their generous gift has enabled us to annually bring an internationally renowned artist and designer to partner with SAIC's faculty and to teach our students. This extraordinary program has brought such luminaries as Andrea Zettel, Chris Ware, Ann Hamilton, Amanda Williams, and last year, Ebony Patterson, among others, to SAIC's classrooms and studios. We are forever grateful for their generosity. Thank you, Stephanie and Bill. During her visiting professorship, Shirin will conduct workshops with students enrolled in the interdisciplinary immediacies course cluster this fall. And in spring 2022, she will join courses in the art history, theory, and criticism, photography, and film, video, new media, and animation departments. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Sean Michelle Smith, Professor of Visual and Critical Studies and Interim Dean of Faculty, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Sean will rejoin Shirin after her presentation to share your questions. To pose a question, please post it in the Q&A box below. You may also click on the CC button below to engage closed captions, which are available throughout the program. With that, I'll hand it over to Sean.
Thank you, Alyssa. And again, welcome everyone to this evening's lecture. It is a great honor and pleasure to introduce and welcome Shirin Neshat as the 2021 Bill and Stephanie SAIC Distinguished Visiting Professor at SAIC. Neshat is an internationally acclaimed artist who makes work that is both timely and timeless. Using the media of film, photography, and video, she produces striking works that oscillate between the registers of the real and an expanded dreamscape. Neshat has often worked in portraiture, inscribing text onto her images. The people she depicts in her black and white portraits meet the gaze of their viewers, greeting them with an almost life-sized presence. In her Women of Allah series, completed in 1997, women wearing chadors and wielding rifles stare directly out at viewers. Their faces and hands are adorned with Farsi calligraphy, a text that adds a layer of meaning to the images and also separates her audience into the readers and non-readers of Farsi. In this way, Neshat invites recognition from any viewer, but also signals cultural specificity. And this kind of double dynamic pervades much of her work. Neshat left her birthplace in Iran over 40 years ago, and this self-imposed exile informs her investigation into identity and place and the politics of both. Throughout the 2000s, she created a series of video installations based on Sharnish Parsapur's novel, Women Without Men. These widely acclaimed and exhibited works would eventually culminate in her first feature film as a director, also titled Women Without Men, which won the Silver Lion Award at the 2009 Venice International Film Festival. In 2019, the Broad Museum mounted a retrospective of her work titled Shirin Neshat, I Will Greet the Sun Again, It included over 230 photographs and 8 video installations. Reaching back to the beginning of her career, the exhibition showcased one of her earliest pieces, Offered Eyes of 1993, a tight framing of the artist's eye with the white painted in concentric rings of Farsi poetry. In her most recent project, she turns that inquisitive eye to the people and landscapes of the United States West. Land of Dreams, which premiered earlier this year at Gladstone Gallery in New York, includes a 2-channel film installation and more than 100 photographs that record the waking and dreaming worlds of the people of New Mexico. In each portrait, she again augments the image's surface, depicting her subjects' dreams in illustrations around their heads and in Farsi along the edges of the frame. The works layer meaning culturally, materially, and temporally, and once again they inscribe the real into an expanded dreamscape. There is so much more to say about Neshat's brilliant and compelling work, but now I would like to invite her to do so in her own words. Please join me in welcoming the 2021 Bill and Stephanie Sick Distinguished Visiting Professor, Shirin Neshat.
Good evening. Thank you, Sean, for this wonderful introduction. I'm sorry that I can't see the wonderful faces of all of you who have joined this session. Let me also begin by thanking Bill and Stephanie Sick for supporting this program that I'm invited in. Also, I would like to thank Elisa Tenney, the president, and again, Sean, Michelle Smith, as well as Delina Collier and Andrea Piero, who have been so instrumental for bringing me to the college, but also organizing this event. Tonight, I'm going to take you on this visual journey and jumping from medium to medium and project to project, at the risk of overwhelming you, I hope not, and I try to do it in a very condensed way. And I would like to end the talk with a clip of 2 to 3 minutes of one of my most recent videos, Land of Dreams, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And of course, with the students, with the young artists, we'll continue tomorrow. But allow me to make a few very general remarks. It's kind of strange looking at myself as I'm talking, but I'll keep going. First, I have to start by saying that there can't be a discussion about my work without speaking about the nomadic nature of my artistic practice. The evolution of my work ever since the start, from still photography to video installation to filmmaking, and recently directing operas, all of which I've never been trained in or educated. And the question is why? And this is a question that I've often asked myself. Is it that I'm fearless or ambitious or talented, or and I think none of the above. And I was thinking about this question as I was preparing yesterday for this talk, and really asking myself, as I'm just about directing a new opera, finished a movie, and starting an exhibition, I asked myself, why are you doing so many different things? And I think I came to the realization why. And it's the question of the way in which I need to keep a certain fire as a human being, as an artist, to keep going, to feel excited. And if I have to explain, that fire is when you're young, when you're a young artist, when you're embarking on a journey that you have no idea where it's taking you, but there's something thrilling and exciting, unstoppable about that journey. And as you get older, that fire starts leaving you. As you become more successful and accomplished and recognized, you start losing that fire. And I think that's what's really important to me, that I don't let that fire die as long as I live. And as long as I experiment with new mediums, I'm reinventing myself, and I'm not repeating myself, and I'm avoiding stagnation. And this could be another reason, perhaps, is the fact that my primary medium is the art world and the artistic photography and videos that are shown in galleries and museums. And I guess in the recent time, I felt a certain disillusionment with the way in which the market, the economy dominates the art world. And then the journey towards cinema, films that I make that take 6 years, and I don't make a penny. In fact, I put in everything I have in the film. It's profit is never a part of the equation, and it takes many years to make a movie. And recently, working on opera, I've already been working for a couple of years, and it never even occurred to me, say, oh, I haven't been paid for this. And I think this is something that it's really important to me, that aside from being an artist that survives from her work, that I'm able to put profit aside. And I think with the artist tomorrow, the students will talk more about that. And so, yeah, keeping that fire going. Also, have to be very clear that, as you can tell, my practice is not a traditional practice. On a single day, I'm working on calligraphy on the photographs, to thinking about videos, editing a video, working on a script for a movie, and again, working on, opera. Aside from all the changes in the forms, as I spoke about, regardless, there are certain things that remain constant in my work. And this is something that I wanted to point about just before I start going through the images. And these are both visual and conceptual. My work has always been deeply personal and not autobiographical, but everything has stemmed from my personal experiences in life and things that have happened to me personally, political circumstances. And in many ways, the characters of my work or the narratives that I tell are projections of things that happened to me or that are important questions that I have in my personal life. And that very often I find that the women in my film, even recently, there are muses that begin to look like me, and their characters very much resemble my own character. The political nature of my work, and I must explain to some friends who don't know, I am a product of a revolution. I left my country at the age of 17, and the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, which basically dictated a long separation from myself and my family and my country. And so my generation, or those who brought the revolution, and that it's deeply affected each one of our lives, whether we have lived inside or outside. So to this day, I'm not able to distance myself from political reality, whether that's in respect to my country, native country, or the adoptive country, the United States, which is in complete conflict with my native country. The question of history, I never been aware of that too much, but when I look back at my work retrospectively, I see how every project I do, whether it's photograph or video or film, they're always making references to certain pivotal political history in Iran, in Egypt, in the United States. I've become sort of subconsciously a narrator of history, and we can talk about that more. And I would like to come back to some of these issues that I'm speaking about later as we talk specifically about projects. Literature. Also, when I look back at my work, it seemed that it's been deeply informed by literature. This means the calligraphy, the poetry that I, inscribe on the photographs, or the songs that are in the videos, or the novel like Woman Without Men that I readapt into a film, or the scripts that I write, or how it's influenced by certain literature. The use of metaphor and allegory has been central to my work. And this goes back to the poetic tradition in the Iranian history. Iran is known for a country of mystics and poets. And I honestly think that has something to do with its political history throughout time. A country that has been ruled by dictatorship over and over again. So the use of poetic language, metaphors, allegorical language is a way to transcend censorship, everything that is not allowed to be said overtly. And even though I live outside of Iran, I seem to be a part of that generation that lives with great fear, and somehow that everything that I have to say is embedded in poetry. Perhaps the most important and consistent pattern in my work is the sense of paradoxical, duality, opposite. Everything that I make, for one way or another, it's embedded in the notion of opposites. In terms of visually and stylistically, it's black and white, often it's magic realism, surrealism, dream and reality. And in terms of the content and conceptually, it's often about East and West, Orient and the Occident, personal, universal, beautiful yet painful, emotional yet political, mystical but violent, fragile but defiant. And we'll go again, we'll touch on this as we review some of the images and projects. Now, let's bring the first group of work that I would like to begin with, still photography. So my friend, if you can begin the PowerPoint. If you go to the first image, and I wanted to say that still photography is the first medium that I embraced. I was not trained as a photographer. To this day, I don't even have a camera, but I began by performing sort of, it was a performative experience, and I directed the photography. But my photography consistently have been about human portraiture, and they have been black and white, highly stylized and devoid of any kind of background, and always inscribed with calligraphy. Now, Woman of Allah, which was my entry to the art world, was created in 1993. And really this series, I could speak about this series for a good hour, but they're kind of a nostalgic point of view of an Iranian artist living outside and looking back into the country and at the Islamic Revolution that happened during her absence. And raising many, many questions. And of course, for all of you to remember that I came from Iran in 1979, and the revolution happened in 1979. So, and then I didn't actually go back to the country for good 12 years. And so this was an extremely difficult period for me. Not only I was separated from the family, and all the diplomatic relationship broke down between US and Iran when the hostages were taken from the US embassy, but also we had a war between Iran and Iraq. So it was a devastating period. There was a religious fervor, a rise of fanaticism, and what this body of work, A Woman of Allah, is about, it's really a focus very specifically on the notion of martyrdom. In the martyrdom, that was the idea that was promoted and sort of encouraged within the Iranian society at the time. An idea that a typical martyr would stand in that intersection of faith, love of God, devotion, self-sacrifice, yet violence, cruelty, and ultimately an obsession with death. So with these images, as you can see, there were a few things at play. The female body, which is very sensual and pretty much erotic. Can you go back to a couple of the other images? Actually, I myself were the one that posed for these images. The texts that were poetry by Iranian women that were revolutionary or had a strong conviction toward the Islamic Revolution. The weapon that's obviously was a representation of violence that the revolution brought to the Iranian society. And the veil, can you go back to one more image? The veil that was obviously the representation or symbolic element of the Islamic regime, and how women were forced into veiling, that for some people was a kind of solidarity with the religious values, for others was purely oppressive. And so these images, again, are extremely paradoxical, where on the one hand, you have all these elements that represent the society and religion, yet the gaze of the woman it's sort of suggesting otherwise. The submission and fanaticism that comes with this sort of conviction, but yet the sense of betrayal, fear, anxiety, and a woman who gives, but can you go to the next images, sorry. The images, and next please. A woman who's able to give birth, but at the same time, it's able to end life. So these images were entirely based on the notion of opposites. And again, I myself played the role. This was without really expecting to have an audience. I was just sort of playing, and eventually became highly controversial by Iranian people, by the Iranian government, by Western critics, interpreting it in many, many different ways, because it's so directly aimed at this political references. Next, we go to the Book of Kings. If the woman of Allah basically captured the moment of Iranian history, can you go to the next image, please? That was the Islamic Revolution, when we had religious fervor, when there was this notion of upheaval, that people who wanted to get rid of the monarchy and see change came in 2009. We had the Green Movement in Iran. It was a new uprising. Maybe the next image, please, where we had uprising by the young people, and again, that notion of sacrifice and confrontation with the regime. But this time, this movement was not about religion, but it was about a demand for democracy. Next images. These were the young people of Iran who basically didn't want to make another revolution, but wanted to see the country to respect an idea of liberty, freedom within this idea of Islamization. Of course, this was treated with brutality by the government, and many of these young people were arrested, tortured, some killed. This body of work, basically, it sort of pays tribute to that notion of patriotism, nationalism, that was no longer related to Iran that we knew in 1979. Can you go back before to the last pages? These are people who were not interested in religion. They were modern, they were forward-thinking, and the gestures of their hands and on their heart was like the Legion of Honor, the idea of love of nation. And the next image, if you go, I took many of these illustrations from the original book of Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, that was written in 10th century by the famous mystic poet Ferdowsi, which basically is another long epic poem of writing about nationalism, patriotism, these epic poems about people who were beheaded and killed on their will to defend their country at the time of the Arab conquest. These three images are the villains that represented the people of power. If you go back to the very original image of the Book of Kings, you'll see that the difference between this series and the Woman of Allah is that the whole photography for me became slightly more narrative. And there were different players, different protagonists, and together all these images, these collections of images told one story, where the Woman of Allah were individual images that told the entire story. And this could be that I was already making some films and videos, and I was already becoming a sort of a storyteller. But the last thing I want to say, can you go forward? Personally, I became very involved with the Green Movement, something that I've never really been. I was never an activist, but like many people from Iran, I became very interested in supporting the young people that were giving their lives in seeing a transition, a change in the Iranian political arena. Unfortunately, it was not successful. Next image, I think this could be the last one. So violence, yet love, patriotism, yet brutality, all of these contradictions, all these notions of dualities that I spoke about earlier. Our house is on fire. by this time, something else changed in me, where I no longer was interested in photographing myself or bringing my friends or colleagues into the studio to photograph. I was invited by the Rauschenberg Foundation. It was a commission to do a new project, and I decided to go back to Egypt in the aftermath of the Green Movement. Soon we had the Arab Spring. We had thousands of people, actually hundreds of thousands of young people across the Middle East and all over the Arab world, just like in the Iranian culture, having uprising revolutions in, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, in many, many places. So can you go to the next image? I went to Cairo with a friend, and we began to, this was the revolution in Egypt happened in 2011. And by the time I went and shot this photographs, which was called Our House is on Fire, it was in the aftermath of the revolution. Next page, next images. Basically, I went and met the families, the parents of the young people who had participated in the revolution, and many of them had lost their lives or were arrested. Throughout these interviews, I was able to hear their stories. And first of all, I shared my story as an Iranian who was now living in exile, and the revolutions that we experienced, and the 2009 Green Movement, and how that had transpired to great amount of brutality and tragedy and loss. Many people then trusted me, and they started telling me their stories of tragedy, and they wept. Basically, this text that you see in this close-up are they're sort of the translations of the stories and what they shared with me on the human level. If you go, I think there's more images after this. Okay, can you go back a little bit? So if you remember, with the Book of Kings were essentially images of young people who brought up all these revolutions that were contagious, euphoric all over the Arab and Middle East. These images are the final chapter, which is the elderly, the people who paid the price for the sacrifice, the notion of patriotism, that their children brought to their countries. And what's happened again, that the installation of Our House is on Fire, just like the Book of Kings, became their narrative. These images together, and the image of the 2 feet, if you go to the image of the 2 feet, that came directly from the morgue in Cairo, when actually the military attacked the mosque and many young people were murdered, and eventually all was remained was this little tag that was their identity. I wrote poetry on their feet, and some of this poetry I used were not just written by Iranian people, but by Egyptian people. Very dark. Okay, the next set of images are the home of my eyes. As I told you, I had now become like not just a photographer, but kind of a reporter. I was next commissioned to go to Azerbaijan, which is geographically and next door to Iran, a country that actually my mother originally is from Baku, Azerbaijan, but eventually was separated from Iran. Azerbaijan is a country that is known for its multi-ethnicity. People who live there are from roots go back to Russia, Armenia, Turkey, Persians. They come from different ethnicities, different languages, different religions, but they all call Azerbaijan home. So I decided, I was invited by a local art organization to come up with a project. And I decided the question that I had was, the notion of home, what home means to us, to everybody, to me, who is homeless, if you advance to the next images. So I recruited people from different ethnicities that lived in Azerbaijan, people who were Caucasian, people who were Turks, people who were Armenians. I interviewed with the help of a translator. I asked every individual, what was the meaning of home to them? What represented that for them? And so we wrote down their answer, and eventually their answers were inscribed on their body. Next images. But one of the things I wanted to share with you at this point, I was also really inspired by Christian religious paintings. And as you can see, although the faces changed, the ethnicities changed, one thing that was common in all of these images was the hand posture that was somewhat like kind of the religious postures. And interestingly enough, this work was invited eventually to be shown in Venice at Museo Carrere. And at that time, the curator at the museum came to me and apologized and said, I'm so sorry, but the room that we're giving you, it has a Madonna that we cannot move. And so therefore you have to install around the Madonna. And it was really ironic because these images that I had done, if you go back a few images, were all inspired by Christian icon paintings. And so I think I shot about 50, 60 portraits of these people that were shown in Baku in this organization. And what was really fantastic was to learn to recruit people, to learn to speak with people who didn't know me. And I had to make them comfortable with who I was and what was my project, which was highly conceptual. And then after that entry point, to be able to create an artwork that I had no idea where it was going. Anyway, without going too long, we have a lot more to talk about. So let's go on to the next body of work. I think now let's go to the first image. So after I made Woman of Allah, I was really, after a few years of it, as I explained to you, I was heavily criticized by the people of Iran, the government of Iran, who by now really was very suspicious of me. The people who hated the government, people who supported the program, the government were equally not comfortable with the work I was making. And then I was criticized by Western critics who felt that I was somehow sensationalizing violence and sort of this radical chic, and and where the government thought that I was being critical of them, where their critics thought that I was endorsing the government. So at some point, I felt, okay, it's time for me to think about the ways to sort of leave behind this direct references to political reality. And I sort of rebelled against my own signature. And by this point, as I explained earlier, my photographs became popular. People liked to see my work with this really exquisite calligraphy on it, which became almost like paintings, and they become pricey. And suddenly I turned my back to all of that. And I started to experiment with video. Now, I never made a video before. Turbulent was my first video in 1998. The one on the left is my husband, who I met by making the Turbulent, and he's staying here, obviously, with me in New Mexico, where we're working together. And Turbulent came again as a way to resist my own signature, as a way to stop making objects commodities. It came with video, this idea of a choreography, idea of storytelling, and incorporating backgrounds, performance. I was a storyteller. The work had a beginning, a middle, and the end. But what was exciting about Turbulent was two videos created on opposite walls. So I think this piece was shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, where the audience are literally seated between the two videos, and one was active and the other one watched, and then the other one became active. And then the audience had to be sort of watching simultaneously the two sides. In other words, they had to be the editor of this video. And I really enjoyed this kind of participatory sculptural interaction between the audience and the video, where this was very much lacking in photography. Next, I go to, I've made so much work that I have to sort of go a little fast. Rapture, which was premiered at the Art Institute of Chicago. I remember when I entered the exhibition, my heart was pounding because no one had seen it, and I was so scared, people wondering, what is this? Let me explain about rapture, that sort of basically turbulent rapture and fervor, which I would show next, created this trilogy that was essentially based on the idea of opposites, the masculine and feminine. If the turbulent essentially followed the musical duet between a man and a woman, that one actually, I forgot to mention that the man was singing traditional music, was the conformist, a man who had an audience. The woman sang this music that was guttural without the audience. And basically, the other issues of the opposite was the camera was stationary on the man. It was rotating around the female. And that if the man stayed within the rules, the woman broke all the rules of traditional music and ultimately became victorious. With Rapture, what we had was a group of men in the space of fortress. If you go back, the women were in nature. So I took this idea of opposites, masculine and feminine, further. Here we had nature and culture, women who were migrating. Can you progress to the other slides? From the next, they were in the desert and eventually found their way toward the sea or the ocean, where the men next, the men pretty much stayed within the confines of this fortress that represented a very typically a masculine space. Rapture for me was incredible. It was getting out of studio, getting out of New York, directing over 200 people. It was for me like actually being a choreographer. I felt like it was that Rapture was really more about dance, and it was about performance, about use of music. Please go to the next image. No, can you go back to the 2 slides before? So for me, it was opening new doors as a way that I can tell my story, and I can be very enigmatic and very allegorical, and I can be political, and my knife could be sharp as I make my commentary about this discrimination between male and female, and yet I could stay away from being directly political. And this is what I'm talking about, this reach toward a poetic way of telling a story, as opposed to depending too much on political iconography. And this became a great lesson for me from Rapture in a way of making highly stylized work. Please progress to Fervor. If Turbulent was made in 1998, Rapture was made in 1999. And in 2000, I was making work of one after another. By the way, I didn't make work until I was 31 after I had my child. So I was a latecomer, but I was trying to make up for all the lost time. I forgot also to say, not only I was not a traditional artist, I was a failure at school. We will speak a lot with the students about it. I almost didn't graduate or didn't get into graduate school. With Fervor, I took on where I left off with Turbulent and Rapture, the idea of the masculine, and feminine. But Fervor, it became about another topic, about temptation, about how in the Islamic cultures, particularly where I came from after especially after the revolution, is that the most basic instinctive nature of human nature, the idea of desire for opposite sex and temptation, is considered shame and sinful. Next. So we created this kind of theatrical event where it was a group of men on one side, a group of men on the other side, and they were separated by a curtain. And basically they were dressed by a mullah or maybe an actor who was constantly preaching to them about how to refrain from desiring an opposite sex. And this was all done through using a painting, a traditional type of theater, which we call passion play. So again, was never directly done, but it was very much indirect. This is the first time with fervor that I began to work with professional actors. And this was a major departure for me. And 2 Iranian actors that I brought. By the way, all of this work was shot in Morocco, and where we made believe that is Iran. Of course, it wasn't. Next. Okay, so moving fast to, can you go to the next image? So after all of the work that I'd done with video and photography, I took 6 years of hiatus and I made Woman Without Men, which I will come soon. But after I finished Woman Without Men, I had this extreme desire to go back to the simplicity of my video installations. And that's why I'm trying to stick with videos while we're talking. But with videos now, they started to become more cinematic because of my experience in filmmaking. If you go back one image, this is Roja that was shot in 2016 in New York. And Roja essentially, and from this point on, is the beginning of my obsession with dreams. The video of Roja is based on one of my own dreams. And talking about duality, and I've been very, very interested for a long time how dreams manifest our true character and our subconscious we are very much truthful and naked, and how when we dream, all these dreams and all these fears and anxieties we have in real life visit us. For me, much of my dreams are about my home, about my family, about things that I'm fearful of. But there's always this references to places and people that I have known and been in, but also nothing makes sense. So wanting to stay away from reality, as I said, I started to make a series of videos called Dreamers. Roja belongs to that group of work. It's a trilogy of Roja, Sarah, and Illusions and Dreams. It was shot in 2016. Now you go forward. And again, this was based on my own dream or nightmare, if you can call it, that I had a footing in America, in American landscape. And can you progress one more? And I was faced with an American singer, and I was sort of embedded in what was happening. And then once I stood outside, and I want to say that with this new series of work, I started to have muses, women that sort of played me if I took myself away from the self-portraiture. Now there were women appearing like Roja that even started to look like me. They're much younger, but they're small, they're always wearing black, they're very simple. And so she, in this video, if you progress one more, she while she's in the US, she sees far in the distance her mother figure, and once she arrives, it's her mother, but in reality is the motherland. In this video, what I was really touching on is, again, this opposites about the mother being the motherland, and then the native, or I'm sorry, the adoptive country being the US, this two worlds that are pulling apart, and she's conflicted between the two, and both sides are unwelcoming and brutal and sort of violent. I hope you can see the video at some point. I have one more video, which is Sarah. And these videos go back to the simplicity of my earlier black and white work. But again, there is a protagonist, there's a beginning, middle, and the end. They become slightly more cinematic, but quite enigmatic. With Sarah, it's less about the motherland, it's fear of extinction, of dying, of mortality. And she has these flashes of the army, the military coming her way. And next shot, of women bringing instances. Again, these are some of the fragments of images of my own dreams that I try to bring to video. And so we have nature. In Sarah, we focus on the forest and the water. In Roja is the desert. And I'm skipping the next one, which is illusions and the mirrors, because we still have so much to cover. Now, Land of Dreams. Land of Dreams is my latest project, and it's very important to say that many things have shifted for me in these recent years. This exhaustion from always working on themes and narratives that is always making references to my past, to my country, where I was born, where I'm no longer welcome. You can stay here. Where I'm not able to visit, and everything is sort of reduced to memories. And somehow I felt that I have lived longer now in this country, in the United States, than in my own country. And in the recent years, so much has happened that I felt that it was time for me to turn my lens toward America, even if that lens, that perspective is that of an immigrant. Land of Dreams is also the first time that I make a work that simultaneously brings together my interest in still photography, video installation, and film, all under one project. I came to New Mexico, where I'm sitting today, where I've fallen in love, where it resembles Iran for its landscape. And in 2019, I came to do a group of photographs where I traveled all across New Mexico, from Farmington, where it's a heavily sort of Native Americans and Navajo Nation lives there, to the city of Las Vegas, to Albuquerque, where quite a bit of Hispanic immigrants, Native Americans, and of course the Anglo community live. I traveled all over with two friends and my dog, and basically recruited people of diverse ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds, just like the home of my eyes, and basically brought them to my hotel, to the pizza parlors, to streets, to their home, and basically asked them the question of what is your latest dreams and what is it that you're dreaming about lately. A lot of these people came for that small incentive of the money we were able to pay them. Can you go to some of the images? This is actually the woman who played in the video. Again, just like Roja, she was my muse. Again, she was now not only an Iranian, but she was an Iranian photographer that you will see in the video. Next. So I went, I interviewed all of these people one by one. For each person, I spent about 30 minutes asking them first about their personal lives, where they come from, what they're doing with their lives. Some of them were very fully functional, some not functional. Some you can advance to the next images. Some were somewhat economically poor, some okay. None of them were super rich. In this picture, you see a Native American on the left, an African American who happened to live there. And it was one of the most amazing, profound experiences going as an immigrant, as a nomad, meeting different people who, in my mind, created what I consider America. This group of work became a portrait of America in my, this is what America looks to me. These diverse faces, people who, similar to me, were actually on the threshold, being nervous about where the future looked like in America. And so we talked a lot about that. And the writing, the calligraphy that you see behind this wonderful people are actually my research going back to an ancient book. Can you go to the next image? Maybe, no, can you go back maybe two more? We researched and went back to one of my assistants to a library in Iran, a book that is loosely an interpretation of dreams. And so having collected these people's dreams, we went according to the categories. And basically, you know, in dreams, you have animals that don't make sense. There's half cow, half snake, and all of that. So the illustrations were added as well as the writings. The writings that are small are they you know, what is basically the interpretations, but the ones that are bold are simply their names and place of birth and the date of birth of the subjects, people who were not able to share their dreams or couldn't remember their dreams. But ultimately, if you go back to the very initial images when we started, the collection of the images, as you can see, was important to me. When the audience entered this room, they were confronted by 111 photographs, all of whose eyes were, the gaze was on the audience, that you were no longer just observing them, but they were observing you. And these are all American people. And that for me, I cannot even, I get very emotional talking about it, but it was really an eye opener for me that I can begin to make work about America, no longer about Iran, because the work will always be Iranian because I am Iranian. It is always going to be seen from the perspective of an Iranian. Let's advance to the video of Land of Dreams. So Simin, who I, no, back please. The video of Land of Dreams, which actually we're going to see a 3-minute clip, is a composite version, a composite projection. We shot here in New Mexico, where I am. I fell in love with the landscape of New Mexico. Here, this incredible mountain is a sacred mountain in Farmington, in the border of New Mexico, Arizona. And that this video, it's about two different worlds. On the one hand, if you advance, you have a small town in America where this lady, Simin, who's Shimin, as you could say, Shirin, Simin, is a woman who basically works at a colony whose job is to, next shot please, to go every day to American people's home. She disguises herself as an artist and she collects people's photographs, but then consequently ask for their dreams. And so many people don't allow her inside the home, but many do, like this image, which you'll see in a minute in the video. Can you advance to the next images? These are some of the peoples, in this case, a native in a reservation. And then she ultimately goes back to this very sort of peculiar, strange colony, Iranian colony. Obviously, it's very stylized and it's absurd and it's a political satire, it's not realistic. But we worked in this power plant near Albuquerque. We created this space where all these men and women, Iranian, dressed in white lab coats, were busy sort of going through American people's portraits and their dreams and interpreting them. Obviously, this is absurd, but it was a sort of a kind of a satire making a reference about this perpetual antagonism between US and Iran, and the fanaticism and the idea that Iran would even think about spying on American people's dreams. Now, if you stay here with me, I talked about opposite. Here in this video, we're talking about dream and reality. Iran and the United States. We're talking about an individual woman who herself is living within an extremely oppressive, suffocating atmosphere and a society such as in Iran, Iranian society. And yet we're talking about United States, we're talking about the world, we're talking about governments. And then the film is partially shot in this magnificent open landscape. Then we have this terribly claustrophobic industrial interior space. Can you advance? And then we had this mullah, this man who's a hierarchy, who again represents a person of power. Let's advance. I mean, I could speak about this project for a long time. But as you can see, the landscape of America also strangely resembled the landscape of Iran. So it's extremely nostalgic for me and my team, who were very much Iranian majority, to go back to New Mexico and create a work that the audience was wondering, is she telling us we're in Iran or are we in US, etc. And then shooting it in black and white. Let's advance to the movie. Or yeah, this is actually, I think we are about to see the video, if I'm not mistaken. A short clip, and then I'll come back.
Thank you. So you're in the army?
Yeah, I was there.
For how long?
Too long, way more than I care to remember.
It's really amazing photographs.
Yes, I was there for that one.
Actually, do you mind if I just ask you one more favor?
I guess so.
Would you tell me your last dream?
My last dream. You know, it's always the same dream. Same place, same time. No, it isn't a dream. It's a nightmare. There's this whitish blue light that shoots across the sky, you see. Black smoke rises to form a cloud that covers the sun. I can now look at the sun directly with naked eyes from behind the black smoke. I hear people screaming. The sun is gonna fall. The sun is gonna fall. A strong wind sweeps across the land. The air is full of dust and flying objects. And then there's silence. Dead silence. The sun has died behind the deep black cloud as it starts to rain. Black rain. Raindrops of oil and...
Okay, I've been told I have 10 minutes to go, so I go fast. So in 2019, we shot the video, and then in 2020, during the pandemic, from September until December, we shot the movie, which was scripted and fully scripted by Jean-Claude Carrier and my husband and partner Shoja Azari, the singer from Turbulent, and the same actress played the role, and this is in principle, there's the same concept: an Iranian woman living in the U.S. collecting people's photographs and dreams, but at the same time, she's working for the Census Bureau, not the Iranian colony. And now the attention goes back to the idea, the notion of surveillance in the United States. It takes place in the near future, and we have two male characters that are quite dominant, Matt Dillon and William Mosley. I got to work with great cast. There's a lot of absurdity, humor, but just like in the video, it's quite absurd, and it's a kind of a political satire, and simultaneously pursuing the single woman's trajectory as a woman, Iranian woman artist who's living in exile, at the same time pursuing the country of US and what is happening there. I wanted to say my interest in cinema, and this film just opened at Venice Film Festival, which was a great honor. And just as we go forward with me talking about movies, my interest in this is Isabella Rossellini, another actress who played in the film. My interest in cinema, it's very important to share, is that I embrace new audience. A lot of these people don't even know my work as a visual artist. And the idea of being able to tell a story that is scripted, it has a sense of comprehension. It's not just an extended video installation, but it has a sense of continuity, a flow, meaning, but still it's very visual, it's very conceptual, and it's made from the perspective of a visual artist. Land of Dreams, the woman is actually an artist. It's very much about myself, my experience in this country. Let's advance to the next film, Woman Without Men, my first movie back in 2009, was based on a book, which was a magic realist book that was extremely difficult to readapt into a screenplay for women during 1953 in Iran. It was shot in Morocco, but also the country of Iran was undergoing a coup d'etat. So again, we had the plight, the trend, the journey of four women as they looked for an idea of freedom and independence. And we had the country of Iran as it was fighting colonialism, the fight against US, CIA, and the British government. And so the story also took partially in an orchard and also in the city of Tehran. And then next, I worked here with non-professional actors for the most part. The next big project, and I wanted to tell you, each project took me 6 years. It took double that, so much more than having children. I could have, but it really was difficult, and they're not perfect. These are work that it was painstakingly hard, but I'm sort of grateful that I did it. Kulthum next is an Egyptian singer who died in the 70s. She's one of the most iconic female singers in the Arab world. It was a tribute to an artist who was able to rise above and beyond all male artists, but also to this day is the one thing that all the Middle Eastern agree on, is their love for Kulthum. But the film was a film inside of a film. It was about an Iranian filmmaker, me, trying to make a film, an impossible task about an iconic mythical Egyptian singer. The greatest challenge was that I'm not Egyptian and I don't speak Arabic. And this film was extremely controversial. All these films traveled through festivals, and I traveled to festivals and is shown in cinemas. Last but not least is the opera. In 2017, I opened the first video opera that I did, Aida, by Verdi. It was at Salzburg Music Festival, one of the finest music festivals in the world. The director of the festival shocked me and inviting me to direct it. And these are some of the images from the 2017. This opera is coming back in 2022. So I'm making major, like an 80% revision. It will include videos, and I'm going back. I'm very busy working on this opera at the moment. And there's about 300 people on the stage, with fantastic singers. But what I wanted to say with opera, it's also about music and image. It's very little language. And it was an incredible journey for me to be able to work with a team that can collaborate and teach me quite a lot. On this note, I'm going to stop and welcome any questions you might have. And I wish so much I could see all of you. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you tomorrow morning. Sorry,
Shirin, that was amazing.
too much to cover.
It was amazing. So much work. Thank you for sharing it with us. We do have some questions that are coming up in the queue. And so let's see, I'm just going to jump right in. So one person asked or stated first, when you talked about how your time in the US has now surpassed your time in Iran, it really spoke to me. How do you reconcile the two cultures inside of you?
That's an excellent question. I think that emotionally, I'm still very Iranian. They say, there's an expression, they say, you can take an Iranian out of Iran, but you cannot take Iran out of an Iranian. And even though I've been away since 17, and I don't see my family very often, my emotions are very much in that way my foundation as a human being. And yet I think in my personality, my character is very American in a way that I want my independence, and my community of people that I spend most of my time in majority are Iranian. My partner is Iranian, but also I'm quite international in terms of my community. And one of the things I want to mention is that one thing that has happened to me, I always feel like an outsider, whether I'm within the Iranian community or American community or European. There's something about the fact that I don't think I would ever feel again to be like everyone else, to look like everyone else all the time. And I think that's just something, that idea of belonging has lifted from my vocabulary forever, and I'm just not sure if I ever will be able to go back. And so for the moment, I'm very proud and American and Iranian, and I'm going to have to live this life.
Thank you. Another question. Does your work help you deal with the trauma of war and the uncertainties of daily life? How were you able to center yourself to do this work during tumultuous times, personally and globally?
Another really good question. I was talking to a friend the other day that we as Iranian people, we live with so much fear. And I think that has happened to me. Even if I live here in the United States, I have fear about what's going on in Iran. I have fear about my stability in this country, my future. And I think a lot of us, especially these days, are inundated by fear and pandemic, of disease, of war, of violence, of abandonment, of displacement. And I think that I live with huge amount of anxiety and fear. And as I said before, my work is very personal, and all of those emotions and that I feel, I put in my work. And I feel that's the only most honest way I can be with my audience, because just like in our dreams, they're quite universal, and our fears are also cross boundaries. And at this global moment that we live in, I don't think my fears are that different than you in Chicago or you from another country. So I feel that I infuse all those personal issues that I have experienced as a human being, as someone who's been, again, a product of a revolution, separation from the country, living an immigrant life, living in exile, into my work. So hoping that others who look at this work will identify with some of these emotions.
Thank you. What do you consider to be your muses and main sources of inspiration?
I think, you know, I pay a lot of attention to music. I get a lot of satisfaction and inspiration from great novels. I feel that we live a life that it's constantly about being presentable and being what is expected from us. But art, culture, however we can get inspiration that sort of feeds us spiritually, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, they can help us cope and be charged in a way that life does not remain as a chore. It's important. I think, especially these days, this last year and a half, we all have had to find ways to escape and transcend the difficult times. So for me is whatever I can get my hands on, and that goes back to culture, to great music, great film, great work of art, whatever I can get that helps me believe that there's something more in life than what's in front of us. And I think that's why I'm an artist, because I'm a strong believer that art can give hope and can charge people in the moments of crisis.
We have a question about the vast open landscape that often appears in your work. And, if you think that represents, or what you think that represents in terms of the psyche of an immigrant or a nomad or outsider.
Well, it's very interesting that Iranian people have such an affinity with the desert landscape. There's something about the barren landscape, the emptiness, that I think there's a relationship between mysticism that we experience from my culture, the notion of melancholy, the notion of void, absence, and that it's really profound. It's very, very profound, which is very different than, let's say, forest or a place that you're inundated with many different parts of geography. And I think that the sense of melancholy that I find is not depressive, it's beautiful, but it's dark, and it's somehow a way of tapping into a kind of a spirituality and mysticism that I think it's so Iranian or so Middle Eastern. And that's why, I have to confess to my friends, I'm here in New Mexico because I've been spending a lot of time here, but my husband and I are fantasizing about living in a desert because we feel that that is so much part of our roots, and how much landscape affects you psychologically and emotionally. I'd forgotten because I live in New York. So I couldn't say enough about that.
You talked about binaries and opposites and paradoxes. And can you say a little bit about what those binaries, even including black and white, what role do they play in the imaginative geographies, ethnographies, and sexuality in the global North?
Sexuality. I always describe to people that there's always two worlds that lives inside of us and out. Who I am inside of me and who I am to you as you look at me is two different reality, right? Every one of us. And I think as artists, there's this certain madness, certain craziness that runs through our minds, that which is very beautiful. It is where we're completely truthful and naked. And I think every one of us in a way are sort of always living in this double life, double reality, and the masculine and the feminine. And as we get old, it sort of continues to evolve. And I'm very, very interested in bridging the inner and the outer world. And I think sometimes you can do that by the way you tap into the landscape, the orchard versus the city, or the desert versus a power plant, or I don't know how to say it. I feel like by emphasizing this duality inside of us, I am pointing at the reality of our humanity, that every one of us is always conflicted between who we are and who we are meant to be, who we are supposed to be. We suffer a great deal because of that. And this is regardless of whether we're artists or not. And we all want to look beautiful and desirable and sexual, but we also feel so ugly and undesirable and fighting against our humanity and our aging and all of that. So I think, I'm not sure if I answered the question right, but this is something I'm battling with on an everyday basis, and I try to bring that to my work.
I think a lot of people were excited when you talked about an internal creative fire. And so we have a question about how do you tend it? You know, how do you tend it as you're making work that's more experimental, less commodified, work that might even be misunderstood?
Yeah, you know, and I really meant it. I talked to a friend of mine who's going through a very hard time, and as he's aging, and I talked to him about, well, what is life like when you don't have that fire in you, that will to have that sense of excitement, something new, something that keeps you on your toes, something that you don't know where it's going to end, and that regardless of how old you are, whether you're an artist or not, we have to embrace that fire that should live within us until we die. And I do have to say that I'm always very disappointed when I meet a lot of successful artists, that I feel that they're also treating their artwork as if it's a pattern. It's as if it's something like a job, like a career, as if they've been praised so many times, they've been approved so many times, and it's a done deal. And I just wonder, well, don't you want to fail? Don't you want to not know, you know, where you're going, the direction you're going, and that you shouldn't know where you're going, and I find that ambiguity, that anxiety, that fear of the unknown, it's what keeps you going. And I think that if you take that away from the equation, it's death. And so this is something I firmly believe in, and this is how I could explain why I'm so restless with my life and the way I approach mediums. And I often make work that are not great. And this is something I want to talk to the students, that expectation that artists should be making masterpieces, or no, we're not. We're here to experiment and experience life. And some of times it's good days and some days it's not good days. Now it's like a picture.
Particularly beautiful place to end this conversation on, and I'm so thrilled that you will be with us.
Sad. I can't see my audience. I'm in tears because I just feel like that's a great loss for me to make eye contact. But this is the virtual time that we're living. I want to thank every single person who has been present in this time. I am nervous. I'm always nervous when I'm talking because there's so much to tell. But thank you for your wonderful questions, and thank you, the School of Institute of Art in Chicago, Art Institute of Chicago, and for listening and for inviting me. And have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Shirin.